Hello, thank you for joining another TeamSense Tuesday webinar. My name is Caroline Rizzo, and I'm joined today by Justin Sears. Today, we're going to talk a lot about employee attendance apps versus non-apps, and we'll really get into the nitty-gritty behind which your employees actually prefer. Before I introduce ourselves, let's get into some housekeeping items. So as always, we encourage questions throughout the webinar. We just ask that you place them in the Q&A panel that's at the bottom of your screen. We will get to them at the end of the webinar, so just please be patient. We'll make sure to get to them, but feel free to just throw them in there really throughout the webinar. And then also you may have noticed that we are recording this webinar, so we will be sending out the recording later on today to everybody that registered. You'll get an email with a YouTube link. So if you have to drop early for a meeting or you want to come back and revisit the content, it's always there for you. Also, I should mention too that if you ever want to take a look at any of our past webinars or keep an eye on future webinars, you can always go to teamsense.com/webinars. We do these every Tuesday, and obviously we love seeing new faces, so come join us every week. Without further ado, let's introduce ourselves. So, hello, my name is Caroline Rizzo. I'm the marketing manager at TeamSense. I've been with the company for a little while now, but actually used to come from the world where I was actually trying to sell apps to people. So I do have an interesting perspective on that side of things, but super happy to be here today and chat more about this really great topic. And Justin, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I'm Justin Sears. I run marketing at TeamSense, and uh, it's great that you're here to represent the experience of marketing an app because, as we will make very clear, TeamSense is not an app that's downloaded to a phone. It's a text-based messaging system, and we're going to talk about the differences there. What I will say is I'll be focusing on the employee experience of using an app versus a non-app, and I'd like to ask you, Caroline, to focus a little bit more on the HR experience. Because if we're talking about the frontline worker, the frontline employee, and their experience, guess what? The HR teams that support those workers, they are impacted by the choice of whether to use an app or whether to use a non-app. So let's jump
Absolutely.
into it.
Let's go in. Yeah.
Here's the big question. And uh, what happens when you ask 1,000 employees to download an app to their personal phone and ask, maybe it's an ask, maybe it's a policy, but you're telling people to do something for work with their personal phone. And next slide will give an example of what tends to happen. You get revolt and revolution. Now, of course, this is from Les Miserables, so this is an older time frame, but I think it conveys the attitude of, hold on, what? I bought this phone, I pay the bills on this phone, and now you want me to put something on it to help track my attendance or call off, and it doesn't end well.
Yeah, I'm gonna have the Les Mis soundtrack in my head the rest of this webinar. But yeah, it's so true, and I think it all stems around trust. And we'll get more into that. But I think the next point that we'll kind of cover a bunch of different topics for the reasons why for revolt. But I think number one that we're thinking about here in the initial reaction is obviously privacy. You want to kind of jump a little bit more into that, Justin?
Yeah, the first reason that hourly employees will refuse to download an app is that they fear that their employee might overreach into their personal privacy. They ask themselves questions like, could they track my location? Will they micromanage my work habits or what I'm doing on the floor? Will they see into my personal activities outside of work because folks are spending 8, 9 hours at work, but then most of the time they're doing their thing and in their private life. And there's a real concern based on actual incidents that have happened that employers or supervisors will overreach and look, we know from the people that we work with that that's the furthest thing from HR teams' minds,
Mhm.
but it doesn't keep employees from thinking that, especially in tough times when they might have doubts or fears about something else. It's really easy to think of the worst case scenario as far as apps go.
Yeah, and I think in today's age, more and more people are becoming more concerned about their data and how they protect it and really the privacy around it, and really actually understanding the transparency behind how that data is being used or how it could potentially be used. And so I think there's some really interesting real world examples out there, really in the media. I think, Justin, you can talk to it a little bit more based on what you've read.
Yeah, and preparing for this webinar, Caroline, and the research I did, there's a lot of this goes back to COVID-19, which really fundamentally changed the way we work. And that's true for folks who work in an office, folks who work in a factory, folks who work in a warehouse. It changed a lot. And TeamSense was founded actually as a direct result of the COVID pandemic and the goal of helping manufacturing workers get back into the factory safely. But COVID-19 also revolutionized expectations about office workers working from home. So a lot of the articles are kind of focused on office workers, and that's not really the audience of employees that we serve. But this article from CNBC seems focused on office workers, but the issues of trust that it's talking about, you can see it in the quote there. Those uh, issues of trust and comfort with surveillance or bossware, or there's lots of names for it, those are shared across different types of employees, office workers and folks that work um, outside of the office or deskless workers.
Yeah, absolutely. But even, relating to kind of wasted time, this really does have an impact on factory workers in particular. I think this is a really interesting article from Washington Post.
Yeah, and there's a large company that sells a lot of things online who have become notorious for tracking in great detail everything that their employees do. And so uh, that company has earned a lot of headlines. And so, look, at your site, you might be operating with the utmost respect, but those headlines are still out there. And like I said before, those thoughts are still going to occur. And so, um, employees in manufacturing and logistics have those same concerns about protecting privacy on their personal phones, and they want autonomy in their work. On the floor, folks are making decisions all the time about how to be most productive. And the thought that those decisions might be questioned or second guessed based on some tracking that doesn't understand the context that they're
Mhm.
making the decisions in, that's demoralizing. And so requiring employees or even asking them to download a company app to their personal device triggers that type of discomfort, which is, you can see it here in the quote. Wasted time, one person's wasted time is another person's. I had to do it like this because the thing was broken and I had to take a different path. And it's
Mhm.
very important to keep that in mind when you start kind of gathering more data on how people are working.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, obviously, kind of a lot of thought is around non-transparency and fear that comes up. One thing that I think is interesting to point out too is that if I'm an HR manager, really my goal is to never compromise my trust with my employees, right? So, as an example, we've seen companies that have a bring your own device policy. So, if workers do choose to utilize their own device, which most of the times they do, they have to sign a policy. And essentially, what that does, though, is it gives the company permission to potentially search through someone's phone if there was a data breach, right? So, if data has been compromised in the company, there's been a breach, then they technically have the right to go through your personal device in that case. So, here as an HR manager, you're coming from this perspective of, oh, no, I'm not going to go through your phone or your data. Like, that's crazy. Um, but you may want to have a better understanding of your policy and what that could potentially, the repercussions of that. So that's something I think, you know, keeping in mind the HR manager and their goal of transparency. Obviously, you want to be transparent and earn that trust, but you don't want to be in the position where you potentially would have to break it, right?
Exactly. And this article I found in a local periodical in the Missouri Independent, and you can see these decisions affect unionized labor shops, and also the second quote is about employees. So again, that idea of transparency, of accountability, of your somebody is watching digitally how I'm doing certain things, and I don't have that same visibility into what they're seeing or the decisions they're making. And so that that difference in visibility and accountability or in transparency is something that people will have an emotional response to, and that affects their satisfaction at work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's with any really employee, and that's again, I think COVID really kind of created this sense of I have my own time, I own my time. I should be trusted as an employee. And so I think that people have kind of stopped putting up with companies that frankly don't trust in their work. I think this next graph really kind of hits home really how tight the labor market is and really how important it is for HR managers to be focused greatly on employee retainment. You've talked a lot about this graph in the past, Justin. Would love for you to shine some light on it.
Yeah, I mean, we shared this at a webinar maybe a month ago, a month and a half ago, when I was speaking with our CEO and co-founder Sheila Stafford. And the point of this is that, I'll take a little segue here. When I was doing research, a lot of the articles said, "Hey, employee surveillance has been going on for a long time." In fact, Ford Motor Company used to send managers into people's homes just to check in on them. And there was no digital device. It was actually a knock on the door. Now, the difference between probably Ford Motor Company in the early part of the 20th century and now is employees have more options. And this graph is an indication of that. So if you're an employee at Ford Motor Company 100 years ago, it was probably hard to switch jobs, right? There was a big plant in town and not a lot of stuff going on in the early days. Now you have a lot more manufacturing capacity coming online, and we talked about this in the other webinar. Look it up because we'll go into it in more detail if you watch the recording. But the point is this: if people are feeling uncomfortable by how much they're being surveilled or surveillance in their workplace, they have options, and they know they have options because the labor market's tight. And if you go into any of the major cities where we have customers, people tell us, hey, we have to retain employees because it's really hard and really expensive to find skilled employees that can do these jobs. These are hard jobs. And so we're working really hard to keep them. Adding that layer of mistrust that an app might create is going to go against that goal.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And as an HR manager, the last thing I want to try to do is have to recruit new talent because that's a huge time drain. It's a money drain, cost drain is super high. So that would be my perspective is anything I can do to retain is key. Um, so let's talk a little bit more about the second reason for revolt. Fairness is obviously key. And I love this image comparison on the next slide.
Yeah, and this is pretty common sense. So remember, if you ask people to download an app, you're asking employees to do something probably for good purposes, right? You want to make it easier for people to tell you if they're not coming in. All the intentions are noble. However, in any working group, there's going to be folks like the guy on the left who's not working as hard as everybody else in the picture on the right. Now, how do you feel if you show up on time every day to work and you're a star employee, but you have to download an app to your phone to watch the guy on the left and make sure he's performing? And, on any floor, folks know who those folks are. And it's really not great for trust, morale, transparency. A culture of accountability is what you're really trying to build. And an app or a request to download an app makes the folks that are working hard resent a little bit having to do something to keep an eye on those that aren't.
Absolutely.
Did you notice it when you were working at the company that was I think was this the app that was for ag? The ag
Yeah,
sector?
absolutely.
Was that an issue, or probably a different type of work environment than what we're talking about? But
Definitely a different type of work. I think actually I take from my own personal experience back when I used to work for a wedding venue when I was in high school, and we had to download an app at the time which tracked our hourly work, and some people just refused to download it. And and it was really hard for, essentially the HR manager at the time to really get them to download it. But then what it created was this level of unfairness. I was like, well, if they're not using it, then why should I have to use it? It's not fair for
Mhm.
me to have to be tracking my hours and being diligent about this. Really, it's not benefiting me at all. So that was kind of the feeling. I think really from an HR manager's perspective, I kind of felt like it was their job and frankly their responsibility to create really a fair and equitable environment in that way. I think that should be any HR manager's really biggest. I think I would say it's probably one of the bigger responsibilities of theirs. And so I think if there's any sort of solution that you can utilize that allows for more transparency, but then also meets the employees where they're at and where they want to communicate, I think that's huge. Obviously, we'll get kind of more into that. But I think the other really interesting tidbit too is really around on our next slide, if we go into the expense side. Um, I think this is a interesting map, but I'm curious to see what it really means, Justin.
Well, and we'll pause for the question. I know we have everyone muted, so you can't really answer the question, but if you haven't answered this, put it in the Q&A. We won't pause too long because sometimes people are shy with the question and answer. But what do these states have in common? California, District of Columbia, Illinois, Iowa, Massachusetts, Montana, New York. They're all over the country. Drum roll. Okay, next slide. Those are the only states that require cell phone reimbursement. There's no federal law that requires employees to reimburse uh, or employers to reimburse their employees for using their personal phone. There are 7 states that require that. And so what this means is that if employees have to download an app and its apps are typically uh, pretty hungry as far as data goes, and they're sending data back and forth. So that's going to gobble into someone's data plan. Now, when you and I were preparing for this, Caroline, you said, well, what about text and TeamSense? Now, that is an information back and forth, but two differences between texting and apps. Text is a behavior that people are familiar with, and they're usually texting as if it were free, and it's less expensive than data plans, and the data exchanged is a lot lower typically than most apps. Also, TeamSense, and we'll get into this, makes that amount of time that you need to spend communicating a lot faster. And so even if on a personal phone, folks are calling off with TeamSense, that's happening very fast and it's not taking a big bite out of whatever data plan that they have. And because it's text, people are just used to doing that without really thinking about the cost, even if the cost is relatively low.
Right. That makes total sense. Yeah, because I did have that question, around and texting and app usage. And it is true that, apps utilize a lot more data, especially out of your plan. And it's just more storage on your phone and more apps that you have to deal with on your phone. And yet again, another thing you have to organize. So that's another big argument towards that. I think, personally for me, I think one of the biggest reasons for revolting, obviously, I know privacy costs, but I think really usability is huge. Adoption, and I'll get into kind of my thoughts on from the HR manager's perspective. But I think a lot of what we see is a resistance to new tech, right? Um, Another app to learn, no thank you. I kind of make the joke, it's like, oh, every time Facebook updates their page, I have to go and relearn it. And I'm not, I'm not a spring chicken, but I'm not old to where I'm not really good at utilizing technology. I would say that I'm the one teaching my parents how to use tools like apps and Facebook and social medias. And now I'm the one that's getting stumped too. So I think what I've seen and what we've seen across different companies, even the best companies may only have roughly a 46 to 50% adoption rate of an app. That would be a huge concern for an HR manager whose goal is really to effectively engage with their employees, right? Frankly, I would see that as a failure because if I'm only engaging with half of my employees, then clearly there's not a high enough adoption rate to make it a meaningful solution. Um, I think this is kind of a funny personal anecdote. You mentioned that I used to work in agriculture, definitely did. And part of our job was trying to get farmers to download an app, right, to utilize on their farm. And um, you're kind of trying to think through what creative ways can we get people to download the app? How can we make the onboarding super smooth and seamless? Do we give them a QR code to scan? Can they go to the App Store directly? The funny thing, though, that we found is when they would go to download the app, they oftentimes forgot what their credentials were, let's say to the Apple Store to
Mm.
download the app. It's like, oh gosh, okay, well, we got to go through that hoop. But then I think the biggest thing that we learned after doing some surveying was we really honestly learned that they prefer communication through text message. And so what did we then have to do? We then changed all of our in-app notifications to text message notifications. So these people have the app, but they're also getting text messages. It'd be amazing if you could just get rid of the app and
That's
just have the text
hysterical.
messages.
So you delivered an app, you went through all the work to get people, and 50% is the gold standard for app. I mean, that's an F in any school, right? Like
Right.
that's not, but then you some of them you convinced, and then you actually went back and unplugged or decoupled that so they could actually text. And that's exactly the insight that Sheila and Allison had when they founded the company was let's just avoid that first step. Let's go straight to text. People know how to use it. It's they don't need to learn anything new to adopt. But there's always like anytime you roll out new technology to people, they haven't tried it yet. They haven't lived it yet. And so they're thinking about other apps and they're
Right.
comparing your app to other apps. Your app might be the easiest thing in the world to use, and the download and onboarding might be perfect, but that's not how they're thinking about it before they use it. They're thinking about the worst case scenario. And so that's really a challenge for adoption. If you go on to the next slide, actually, and I'll pause here and say this webinar is based on a blog post that I wrote about a month and a half ago. So you can go check that out too. We'll give a link to that. If you want to go into kind of more sources and depth into this topic, you can look up the blog post. But look, um, this article says there's 5 key levers to drive more effective tech adoption. And these are things that whatever kind of tech you are delivering, you have to keep these in mind. So first, you have to incentivize technology use. And the article, I didn't print it all out here, but it says monetary benefits or fresh solutions to hard problems can usher in behavioral changes when managed properly. So the hard problem that TeamSense does a great job solving that employees really appreciate is making call off easier.
Mhm.
So that is a way that we find our customers really have success with adoption because most people call off at some point or another, and making that experience a lot easier and transparent for employees aligns their incentive to use this technology. The second one is investing in infrastructure. And the article says, I'll read from the note here, another requisite for creating a culture of technology adoption lies in making the infrastructure around it uh, uh, easy, including IT networks, systems, software, etc. Look, TeamSense is a low-code SaaS mobile platform. So that means that nobody needs to worry about the infrastructure. It is abstracted for the end user and for people that are using it. It just works. And so there's not that mountain to climb before the infrastructure is ready. We can integrate it with back office HRIS or time and attendance systems relatively easily. And that's not something any frontline employee or even HR manager has to worry about.
Mhm.
Number three, and did you have something you wanted to add to that, Caroline?
No, I was just like, yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
So
Absolutely.
this one on this slide is kind of my favorite, and one of the reasons that I love talking about TeamSense and love hearing from our customers so much is that the article recommends make reskilling and learning part of the plan. Well, that is part of our initial concept at TeamSense. Everybody knows how to text, and people have smartphones or even flip phones, and they can text using that. They don't need to learn anything else, and that's why we see adoption rates approach 100% very quickly after our customers roll out um, TeamSense to a site. Number four, don't make it piecemeal. And the article says a piecemeal approach to tech adoption and implementation may feel like short-term progress, but will not lead to the creation of a digitally focused mindset. So that's a mouthful. What does it mean? TeamSense integrates, like I mentioned, it integrates with all the existing HRS time and attendance systems. So to take on TeamSense, you don't need to throw out anything else. And it integrates in such a way that it automatically doesn't feel piecemeal. It just solves that last mile communication challenge and tracking with the employees. And then, one that I don't know quite as much about, but that we're covered at TeamSense is understand how government and policy are involved. Now, this usually has to do with data security, and we've got all those standards in place. Also at TeamSense, the employee chooses what data to provide and how they communicate with the employer. So that's a level playing field as far as what data is in the system. And so,
Yeah,
um,
giving an opportunity for choice is key.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to kind of sum up, and this is the title of this webinar and the title of the blog post, but I'll just recap what we've talked about. If you're thinking about using an app, and let me say one other thing. Look, there are some types of businesses that should probably consider an app.
Yeah.
Those are not manufacturing logistics businesses, retail businesses, hospitality businesses, where employees have a lot more control over their schedule. Um,
Mhm.
those employees will maybe want an app because it gives them more flexibility in picking shifts. It's especially good where shifts aren't as set as they are in the manufacturing or logistics space. Also, technology, if you're in hospitality or retail or some of those other businesses, it's more acceptable sometimes for folks to be on their phone or using their phone while they're at work. That can be a dangerous situation sometimes in manufacturing or logistics. And so, kind of keeping those two things separate is important. But to recap, if I'm just looking at app versus non-app for manufacturing, logistics, and the type of businesses that TeamSense focuses on, we talked about privacy. The app download might track anything in the employee's worst imagination, and that might include even their personal movement and where they are, geolocation data, things like that. Um, with a text-based solution like what TeamSense offers, there's no download, and so there's no worries. Fairness, we mentioned good employees feel they're inconvenienced by those with attendance issues or performance issues. And TeamSense is fair because you only use it when you need it, and we're not asking you to download anything. It's just a phone number. So each site has a phone number, and employees interact just texting that phone number, and they can do that at their leisure when they need to.
Mhm.
Expense, we talked about possible data fees and other expenses. And I mentioned that text is usually by most people seen as free. And it uses less time and takes data. And I'll just pause here for a second. If you compare how quickly employees can call off with TeamSense, it's a question of seconds or minutes. And if you compare that to alternatives such as calling into a hotline with an operator or trying to call a manager directly and find them while they're on the floor, Those things get into minutes, and we hear sometimes even half an hour on hold, things like that. So that is a cost that employees are definitely tallying up in their mind when they're thinking about which technology to use. And then finally, we talked about usability, and fear of learning curve. Before you use an app, you don't know how hard it's going to be to use. You don't know if it's going to be supported. You don't know if you're going to forget your password and you have to call somebody, all of those things. And there's that memory curve too, because if you call off once every 2 months and you're supposed to do that on an app, um, you might learn how to do it and then forget before the next time you have to do it. Nobody forgets. All you have to remember with TeamSense is a phone number and how to text, and that's something that people do every day in their regular lives. To
Absolutely.
add to this summation.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, it's kind of a no-brainer in terms of how easy it is. I think any sort of onboarding, especially at a mass scale that these HR managers are having to do, is really intimidating, really time consuming, and it would be so much easier just to make it easier for the employees, but also making it just frankly easier for HR managers too. It makes it a better two-way communication street. And I think that's what I really appreciate more about the texting option as well.
So how can you get all of these benefits without provoking a revolution? That's the question. So we say choose harmony, align your incentives as an HR team or a management team, a general manager, whoever you are in this ecosystem, align the incentives with the end user employee who you're going to ask to interact with whatever technology you provide. And so I'll talk about 4 advantages of this text-based approach. And just to put it on the table so everyone knows, TeamSense uses text to make communication with hourly workers, between hourly workers and their employer, fast, easy, intuitive, and transparent. So keep that in mind, fast, easy, intuitive, and transparent. And you'll see what I mean when we get into the specific advantages. So next slide, please. So bypass the app download. And all of us have had who have ever downloaded an app. It's not exactly rocket science, but it's a little bit stressful. You don't know if each app is going to behave differently. There's a whole process. So let's go on to the next slide, and this is what it looks like to start using TeamSense. Does it look familiar? It should. It is a standard, whether you're on an Apple or an Android or any kind of device, this text interface is something that people are used to using. And if we go to the next slide, that leads to advantages 2 and 3. Because people are used to using their phone to text and there's no learning curve to do that, it makes communication easier and it helps overcome technological barriers or a learning curve or thinking about how am I going to get this new thing that my employer is asking me to download? How am I going to figure out how to use that and make sure that I can continue to use it? Now, here's where we take, in terms of those 2 topics, it's always best to turn to our employees as, sorry, not our customers as spokespeople for that. So on the left, you see, and this was also a customer webinar that we did this year with Devin Froschhauer, sorry, procurement manager at Yangfeng. And you can find this video online. We include the link, but she says, look, the new generation, they don't want to call a single person ever. They don't want to talk on the phone. They don't talk on the phone. Everything is on social media or a text message. They love the fact that with TeamSense, they can text in and they don't have to ever speak to anybody. And that is why when our customers roll out TeamSense, they get near 100% adoption within days of announcing TeamSense. Now, I say near 100% adoption. I'll just mention that there are some folks that will still prefer to use a call tree. Maybe there's an existing call tree solution or something else or email. TeamSense also does support that. So we support it in the same way that we support text. So it's a structured experience with a an IVR or a call tree solution. It just provides the same choices that you would provide in text forms on a an IVR type of experience. That's just so nobody has to kick somebody out of what they like doing in order to adopt TeamSense. Now, what we see is that when all is said and done, 2-3% of people stick with that other alternative. And once people find how easy it is to communicate with TeamSense via text, almost everybody jumps on board. The second quote is about onboarding. Okay, if I adopt this technology and I ask my employees to use it, how hard is it going to be to teach? And how long is it going to take them to adopt it? And Lou Ann Schaefer, you can look at this video also from a TeamSense webinar. She was very straightforward about it. The amazing part, it's quick. I mean, there's not a lot of training involved. And then getting back to the everyone knows how to text on their phone, we tested a few times with a few of our different team members, but it's really quick and easy, very little training, to be honest with you. That might seem like a small thing, but if you look at the 50% that don't take an app on average, some of that is from mistrust. Some of that is from, I can't figure out how to use it, or I don't want to use it, figure out how to use it. And so making it easy really gets around both of those challenges.
Yeah, agreed. And again, I was able to meet Devin. She's lovely. And one thing that she also touches on in the webinar is the fact that, across however many locations they have between 100 to 150 call offs in a day. And so, in terms of managing that, it's a very manual process with the antiquated process. And so, being able to take away that manual piece is such a huge time saver for HR managers because, again, in the back end, it just automates it all. But I think the other piece that she really touched on, which to me was very personal, was just the fact that when people are calling off, a lot of the times it's for reasons that are not great, right? Maybe something happened to their family member. They're feeling really, really sick and they can't come in. They got into a car accident on the way. There's another fun story about that in another webinar about an employee that actually went and picked up somebody that was on the side of the road, but that's for another time. But I think the mention there is that HR managers typically have to deal with the brunt of those emotional call-offs. And frankly, again, people just don't want to have to talk to a person when they're going through that. They just frankly would rather send them their message, say that I'm out, and then it's done and it's recorded. And the HR manager is notified really quickly as well. So I think that's the other consideration I just had to add from Devin's perspective, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and I've not used an app to call off, but back to that earlier point about if I used it 2 or 3 months ago and knew how to do it then, but I've forgotten, and then I find myself in a difficult personal situation. I'm very ill, I have a family emergency, having to go back and remember how to get into the app, how to log in, whatever those barriers that might be there,
What's my
that
password?
and
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
10 times worse when you're under duress or stress. And all you ever have to remember with TeamSense is what's that phone number, and you can pin it to your phone, or
Save it as a
also
contact,
memorize
right?
it. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
All
Easy.
right, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. I'll go through this really quickly. Advantage 4 is building trust through transparency, and we can click through this pretty quickly. This are some screenshots you can see on our website, and really what we're very proud about at TeamSense, and you can hear it in a lot of our customers that speak about introducing this technology to their teams, is that it really puts the employee, you see the employee experience on the left, um, on the same page as his or her supervisor and management. So the information is captured automatically. Everyone can see it. So in this case, notice Julio here is sick. He's calling off. He can see he's got 3 out of 10 attendance points. So he can make a decision, do I really want to call off? I'm getting a little, my points are going up. He can also see his history. How have I called off before? And so that transparency makes Julio feel like he's seeing things the same way that his employer is seeing things. And on the right-hand side, you can see the supervisor getting an immediate alert. So he knows exactly what's going on. He can start thinking about how he's going to backfill Julio for the day, or if he's going to need to shift people around to make sure that they can hit their production goals. And he's also saying, oh, okay, Julio's doesn't take a lot of time off. He's not a problem. Fine. I'll talk with him. I'll look forward to him feeling better and coming back in. But there's no dispute here because the data is captured automatically and everyone can see what happens. Compare that to situations where there's uh, where some people have more information than others. We've heard HR leaders tell us people swear that they called off and that they left a message, and there's absolutely no way to verify whether that's true or not. And HR folks sometimes say, well, we don't think they did, but we can't say yes or no. TeamSense eliminates that kind of ambiguities because everybody sees the same information, and because it's generated automatically, folks know it's correct and current.
Yeah, absolutely.
All
All right.
right. So I think we got through. So this is the blog post that we're talking about. This is a longer version of the conversation that Carolina and I have just had. So check that out. And I think we have a minute or two for questions. Have we gotten any? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. So obviously,
You tell us about the
before
next week. This is super exciting.
yeah, no, you're great. So yeah, before we jump into Q&A, always love to plug next week's webinar. So I'm really excited. I will actually be moderating this panel discussion. We'll be joined by Sheila Stafford, who is our co-founder and CEO of TeamSense, and Jessica Kinman. Super excited to have her join us as well. She's a senior manager at PwC, and she is the president of Women in Manufacturing Washington. We're going to have a really cool conversation, learning more about their careers and their development, and really just how they've left their mark in manufacturing and tech. So excited to talk more about that next week. We actually sent an email out this morning to register, so take a look at that. It's on social. We'll follow up and you'll get all that information, but we'd love to see you next week. But without further ado, let's hop into some Q&A. While we do that, I just want to put up some resources for you to take a look at. Um, if this seems interesting to you and you saw those screenshots of TeamSense in the back end and you want to know really how it works and actually experience it yourself, I think the best way to do that is to set up a demo. It's really easy. You can go to teamsense.com/demo. You'll schedule time on your calendar. You'll meet with one of our experts and they'll meet with you for 30 minutes to kind of go through the whole breadth of TeamSense as a product. So if you're curious to learn more, go there. But we have some questions coming in. We'll try to get to them really quick. Uh,
Yeah. And
and
I'll
I
just
can,
mention the purpose of those demo is not so much about TeamSense to tell you about TeamSense, but to understand what your challenges are. Because we've worked with a lot of different type of companies, and we're at the point now where we don't hear stuff that we haven't really heard of before, so we can provide a lot of guidance on how to solve some of these challenges, and hopefully with using TeamSense to do that. I see a question here. Let me grab this one. Can you text in multiple languages when using TeamSense? And the answer is yes. And we use AI on the front end so that if folks text in, employees text in languages, we support uh, we just added a few, so I think we're a little bit north of 20 different languages now, and that is huge because if people are communicating via phone about calling off or some other, or even an operator-based system, those operators need to be able to speak the language that the employee is calling in, and that often leads to much longer hold times because TeamSense can recognize different languages and understand them, and we support communication in more than 20, that is a huge advantage for sites that have employees speaking non-English languages.
yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question real quick, Justin. I'll read it if you want to answer. So,
Sure.
how are employees identified if they change their phone number? What if they make updates to their phone, or how are they identified?
Oh, that is that's one of the coolest things about TeamSense, and sometimes forget to mention it. So I'm glad that question came in. Because we're text-based, and we know that I think the number is about a quarter of uh, manufacturing and logistics employees change their phone number every 6 months. I might have that a little bit off, but it's a significant number of folks that are changing their phone number. Um, if somebody texts off to that dedicated phone number for a site and TeamSense doesn't recognize the number, we ask the employee to identify themselves with their employee ID or whatever their identification is, and then we can update that phone number in the record. So what that allows our customers to do is to keep accurate contact information on their employees. That's super important if you have 1,000 employees showing up at your plant. And if you know that by the end of the year, you're only going to be able to reach about 30–40% of them on their phone, that's a bad place to be. TeamSense keeps that contact information up to date, because if you call off with TeamSense, you need to uh, at least correct your phone number in the system. But again, that's an automatic process. It just happens. It matches the phone number that the person is using. And they might decline that request because maybe they're just using a family member's phone or somebody else, so they don't update the record, but at least there's the choice for the employee to provide updated contact information to their employer.
Yeah, we all know how clean data is so important. Nice and scrubby and clean. Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Justin, for the time. Again, take a look at the blog post if you want to learn more. We'll share that in the email with the recording as well, so you can get a little bit more nitty-gritty in the numbers and everything that we shared there. But really appreciate the time. This was a lot of fun talking about this. I wish I had the opportunity to just sell a text solution instead of an app back in my day. It would have been so much easier. So anyway, want to say thanks, and we'll see everybody next week. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.